The drone footage holds station at roughly 800 meters above a dirt track running southwest toward Robotyne. The frame is grainy, shot through summer haze, but the geometry is unmistakable. 3 Leopard 2 tanks have stopped. One is already burning at the hull, its smoke column punching straight up through a windless morning. The second has shed a track on its left side and sits at an angle, its turret traversed rearward as if the crew tried to reverse and found the drive sprocket buried in chewed earth. The third is stationary, engines presumably still running, unable to move in either direction. The field shows no obvious craters, no fresh shell holes. What stopped those tanks is invisible on the surface. It is underneath the surface. What you are looking at is the opening act of Ukraine's summer 2023 southern counteroffensive, and it is already going wrong. This is documented, publicly available footage from Zaporizhzhia Oblast, shot and circulated in the days after Ukrainian forces first attempted to penetrate the Russian defensive belt south of Orikhiv. The date is mid-June 2023. Open-source analysts geolocated the footage using field contours and a visible tree line, placing the scene near the approaches to Mala Tokmachka, settlements sitting behind the outermost Russian minefield belt. What this footage proves is not that the Leopard 2 is a bad tank. It is not. What it proves is that a main battle tank, however capable, cannot substitute for the combined arms breach architecture that makes modern offensive warfare possible. Ukraine had the tank. It did not yet have everything else in the right quantity, in the right place, at the right moment. To understand what Ukraine was attempting, you need to understand the ground. The Zaporizhzhia axis runs south from Orikhiv toward Tokmachka, and beyond Tokmachka toward Melitopol and the land bridge connecting Russian-occupied territory to Crimea. Western analysts had assessed this as the most promising vector for a campaign that could sever that land bridge and fundamentally alter the strategic shape of the war. It was also the axis Russia had spent months fortifying with a density of obstacles not seen in European warfare since the Second World War. Russian engineering units had laid what OSINT analysts and Western military officials later described as among the densest minefields in the history of modern land warfare. The Atlantic Council, drawing on satellite imagery analysis and reporting from Ukrainian engineers, described the defensive belt as running in multiple parallel lines with mine densities that in some sectors reportedly exceeded 10,000 mines per kilometer of front. The system was layered, anti-tank mines on the surface, anti-tank mines buried deeper, anti-personnel mines threaded between them to complicate manual clearance, and in some sectors additional improvised explosive devices placed by Russian infantry. The minefields were not a single obstacle. They were an integrated defensive system. The doctrinal answer to that obstacle system, codified in NATO manuals for decades, is combined arms breach. You push forward armored combat engineer vehicles equipped with mine rollers and plows, armored vehicle-launched bridges to cross anti-tank ditches, engineer dismounts with detection equipment, and suppressive fires to prevent enemy anti-tank teams from engaging the breaching element during its most vulnerable phase. You open a lane, you proof it, you mark it, then you pass the assault force through in controlled sequence. Ukraine had studied this doctrine. Western partners had trained Ukrainian crews on the Leopard 2, the M2 Bradley, and other donated systems, but the training cycle was compressed. In some cases, according to Reuters and New York Times reporting, crew training on the Leopard 2 had been measured in weeks rather than months. Western military advisors involved in planning told journalists afterward that they had recommended a longer preparation period and expressed concern about whether the breach element was sufficiently rehearsed and equipped. Those concerns were acknowledged but not fully resolved before operational timelines compelled action. The Leopard 2 arrived in 2 main variants. Germany provided Leopard 2 A6 tanks, which carry the longer 120mm L55 smoothbore gun and an upgraded armor package. Poland and other partners provided Leopard 2 A4 tanks, an older configuration with a somewhat lighter protection level, but still a credible 4th-generation main battle tank. Combined with donated N2A2 Bradley's Marder infantry fighting vehicles and other Western armor, this represented the most capable armored force Ukraine had fielded Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the critical enabler that Doctrine required, and that proved chronically short, was the mine-clearing equipment. Ukraine operated a limited number of Leopard 2 hulls modified as armoured engineer vehicles or fitted with mine roller attachments, along with some armoured vehicle-launched bridge systems. By the assessments of Western analysts after the fact, the breaching engineer component was undersized relative to the frontage Ukraine was attempting to penetrate and the obstacle density it was facing. One Western officer described it to the Financial Times as trying to push a cork through a bottleneck without the Cork-Puller. Here is the sequence the opening footage captures, repeated in similar form across multiple approach routes during the early days of the offensive. A Ukrainian assault element moves toward the edge of the minefield. The breaching element begins to work. Either the breaching vehicles themselves strike mines before clearing a full lane, or the lane opened is narrower than needed, or a vehicle breaks down under fire, or additional mines are detected before the follow-on force can pass. In any of these scenarios, the follow-on tanks halt. Halted tanks become targets. This is where the Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopter enters. Russia's primary anti-armor rotary wing platform had been operating along this axis throughout the preparatory period. The Ka-52 is a coaxial twin-rotor design, giving it unusual hover and lateral maneuver capability. Its primary anti-armor weapon here was the 9M120 Ataka missile, a radio command-guided system with a range of roughly 6 kilometers, and in some configurations the Vika laser-guided missile with similar reach. These ranges meant Ka-52 crews could engage halted Ukrainian armor from outside the effective reach of most shoulder-fired MANPADS, particularly operating from terrain-masking positions with pop-up attack profiles. Oryx, the open-source equipment loss tracking project that logs only visually confirmed losses with photographic or video evidence, documented the destruction or capture of Ukrainian Leopard 2 tanks through this period. By end of 2023, Oryx's confirmed count of Leopard 2 losses stood at approximately 20 to 22 tanks across all sub-variants, with additional vehicles confirmed damaged. These numbers propagated across international media often stripped of their methodological context. Oryx's methodology documents only what can be confirmed through imagery, deliberately excluding any loss that cannot be geographically pinned to specific evidence. This makes the Oryx figure a floor, not a ceiling. The actual number was almost certainly higher than the confirmed count, while also being substantially lower than the more dramatic claims circulating on Russian Telegram channels. There is a further dimension to these losses that media cover is systematically underreported. Not all tanks appearing as burning or stationary in drone footage were permanently destroyed. Militaries distinguish between a tank that is catastrophically killed, its ammunition cooking off and hull burned beyond recovery, and a tank that is mobility killed, having lost a track, thrown a sprocket, or struck a mine that defeated its running gear without destroying the crew compartment. In the early weeks of the June offensive, a significant proportion of what appeared in Russian drone footage as Leopard 2 kills were mobility-killed vehicles. Ukrainian recovery units operated under extraordinary conditions, moving at night to extract damaged tanks from contested terrain. Reuters and Western defense analysts documented cases of Leopard 2 hulls recovered under fire, returned to maintenance facilities, repaired with parts provided by Germany and other donor nations, and reintroduced to service within weeks. The German-led Leopard 2 maintenance consortium had spare parts pipelines and forward-deployed maintenance teams supporting this effort. The point is not that Ukraine lost no tanks. The point is that the narrative of catastrophic loss dominating early coverage was a significant distortion of operational reality. The Lancet 3 loitering munition also played a role here. Russia's small propeller-driven weapon produced by Zala Aero had been confirmed by OSINT analysts in hundreds of strikes against Ukrainian artillery, air defense systems and armored vehicles. In the Zaporizhzhia theater, Lancet footage showed the munition engaging halted or lightly camouflaged Ukrainian vehicles. Its television optical guidance allows an operator to survey a target from altitude and guide the munition into a top attack profile aimed at the turret roof or engine deck. Because the Leopard 2 is optimized for frontal protection, Its roof armor is less extensive than its glacis plate. However, not every Lancet impact results in a catastrophic kill. Vehicle electronics can be damaged, optics destroyed, and mobility impaired by an impact that a crew survives, and from which the tank can eventually be repaired. Russian helicopter crews adapted their KAF-52 employment early after learning that MANPADS were the dominant threat. Rather than flying close support over the contact line, they operated from positions behind Russian lines, engaging with missiles from ranges where the launchers were outside practical MANPADS reach. Ukrainian crews reported to embedded journalists that knowing helicopters were operating invisibly behind terrain, capable of engaging from kilometers away, imposed a significant psychological burden. Units suppressed engines, dispersed vehicles, and used tree lines for concealment, adding time and complexity to an already difficult breach operation. The Zaporizhzhia minefields had additional design features that multiplied their effectiveness. Analysts examining the defensive construction via satellite imagery published by Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs, analyzed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, identified what they described as a deliberate effort to channel attacking forces. Russian engineers had left apparent gaps or softer ground in specific locations within the minefield belts. These apparent gaps led into kill zones where the minefield actually became denser, or where anti-tank guided missile teams had pre-registered fires. A formation identifying what looked like a promising breach approach could find itself funneled into a concentration zone rather than a clear path. This technique has precedence in defensive engineering doctrine, going back to the Second World War. What made it particularly effective in 2023 was integration with drone reconnaissance. Russian forces operated Orlan-10 fixed-wing reconnaissance drones providing near-continuous surveillance of the approaches to the defensive belt when a Ukrainian element began moving toward an apparent gap. Drone operators could observe and report in real time, allowing indirect fire teams and helicopter crews to respond before the breach was completed. The period from mid-June through July 2023 represents the initial assault phase in which the most dramatic losses were concentrated. As July approached, Ukrainian commanders adjusted. The mass assault columns that had characterized initial efforts gave way to more incremental, methodical tactics. Smaller unit actions, more deliberate mine clearing, and greater use of suppressive artillery fires to neutralize observed Russian anti-tank positions before committing the breach element. This shift produced slower progress but substantially reduced the attrition rate among armored vehicles. By late July and into August, Ukrainian forces began making incremental gains toward Robotyne itself, which ultimately fell in mid-August 2023 after weeks of close combat. The Robotyne lodgment was the tangible achievement of the summer phase in this sector. Robotyne is not a large place, but its capture represented penetration of the outer Russian defensive belt and established a Ukrainian foothold from which subsequent operations could develop toward the deeper defensive lines. Senior Western military officials were notably candid in briefings and statements afterward. A former senior US Army general, speaking to a Washington think tank in late 2023, described the counteroffensive as a case study in what happens when combined arms breach capability is insufficient relative to the obstacle density being faced. He attributed the difficulty not to Ukrainian courage or tactical competence, but to the structural gap between the doctrine that matched the equipment provided and the breach-enabling equipment that was not provided in adequate quantity. Germany and other suppliers had delivered Leopard 2 tanks. They had not delivered Leopard 2 engineering variants, mine plows and roller systems, in numbers matching the operational requirement. The imagery that generated the most international attention was drone videos circulating on Russian military telegram channels showing multiple Leopard 2 hulls in fields, some with tracks blown off, some burning, some apparently undamaged but stationary. These videos were seized upon as evidence of the Leopard 2's inadequacy, a claim that was politically convenient and factually incorrect in the specific way it was framed. The Leopard 2 performed broadly as designed in direct engagements. There are documented cases of Leopard 2 tanks successfully engaging Russian armored vehicles at range, of crews surviving mine strikes that would have been fatal in older Soviet-designed tanks, and of the armor package resisting anti-tank guided missile impacts in the frontal arc, under conditions where older tanks would have been catastrophically killed. The failure was not in the tank. The failure was in the system around the tank. NATO Doctrine treats the main battle tank not as a standalone instrument, but as one component of a combined arms team including mechanized infantry, combat engineers with specialist vehicles, indirect fire support, counter-battery radar, electronic warfare, close air support and logistics. In the months before the summer 2023 offensive, Ukraine received the main battle tank component in significant numbers, the engineer component, the close air support component, and in some respects the logistical support component were incomplete. When a combined arms system is missing major elements, the elements that are present bear disproportionate risk. The terrain around Tokmachka adds another technical dimension. The land is flat steppe, exactly where mines are easiest to lay and hardest to clear, with minimal natural cover. A tank moving across that ground is visible from Russian observation posts within seconds of leaving any concealment. Russian forces used the months of relative stalemate through spring 2023 to construct not just minefields but fire control networks. Artillery was pre-registered on approach routes, anti-tank guided missile teams were positioned in depth. When a Ukrainian column came forward, it engaged not just mines in the ground, but a fire control system built specifically to engage vehicles delayed by those mines. This is the combined arms trap. Slow the attacker, then destroy it with fires while it cannot maneuver. The minefields only needed to stop the advance long enough for Ka-52 crews, artillery spotters and Lancet operators to bring fires to bear on what had become a static target. A tank in a minefield is not a tank in its designed combat context. It is an artillery target. The recovery picture through fall 2023 counterweights the losses narrative. German maintenance teams processed damaged Leopard 2 hulls at facilities in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Track replacements, road wheel repairs, gun damage, electronics faults, and structural repair from mine strikes all proceeded through this pipeline. German defense reporting cited figures suggesting that a majority of mobility-killed Leopard 2S successfully extracted from the battlefield were ultimately repaired and returned to service within the operational period, consistent with the historical baseline for modern armored warfare where recovery and repair rates allow a substantial fraction of damaged vehicles to return to the fight within weeks given intact logistics. The Zaporizhzhia counter-offensive carried broader significance for Western military thinking. Analysts at RAND, the Royal United Services Institute, and European Defence Research Centres published assessments examining what the offensive demonstrated about combined arms warfare in a drone-saturated, densely mined environment. Several themes emerged consistently. First, persistent drone reconnaissance had fundamentally altered the challenge of breaching. In previous decades, a breach conducted under suppressive fires and smoke could achieve relative concealment during the most vulnerable phase. In the Zaporizhzhia environment, Russian reconnaissance drones provided near-continuous real-time surveillance, making it effectively impossible to conceal what Ukrainian forces were attempting. Second, the density and sophistication of the Russian minefield construction exceeded worst-case Western planning scenarios. The layered channeling design, combined with integration with pre-registered fires, represented a more effective obstacle system than analysts had anticipated. Russian forces apparently drew on their doctrinal literature about deep defense with greater fidelity than expected. Third, electronic warfare proved important beyond what footage alone showed. Ukrainian forces reported Russian jamming of drone control links during breach operations, degrading Ukraine's own reconnaissance capability at critical moments when commanders needed real-time intelligence about what lay beyond the immediate obstacle belt. What the footage from June 2023 near Tokmachka ultimately documents is not a failure of Western armor, it is a demonstration of how modern defensive engineering, properly integrated with fires and surveillance, can impose enormous costs on an attacking force, even when that force carries capable modern weapons. The Leopard 2 tanks in those images were not defeated by a superior tank. They were stopped by a minefield and then engaged while stationary by systems operating at ranges at which the Leopard 2's excellent frontal armor was functionally irrelevant. For any analyst studying this footage, the technical takeaways are clear. Mine clearing capacity must match obstacle density, not the number of tanks in the assault. Breach operations in drone-covered environments require electronic warfare protecting the breaching element specifically, attack helicopters at extended range are a critical threat to any halted formation, and the recoverable versus permanent loss distinction matters enormously when assessing the true attrition picture of any engagement. The Leopard 2 tanks lost in this campaign were lost because the system around them was incomplete, not because the vehicles themselves failed. The ones recovered, repaired and returned to service are the other half of that story, the half that never appears in drone footage shared across Telegram channels, because a tank driving under its own power back to a maintenance facility generates no dramatic imagery. The Zaporizhzhia summer is ultimately a story about combined arms, about what those two words mean in operational practice, and about the price of sending one component of a complex system into a fight that requires the whole system to succeed. That is what the frozen frame of a burning tank in a flat Zaporizhzhia field actually tells you. Not that the tank failed, that the system around it was not yet complete.